Thank you for listening to the Chronicles of Christendom, a survey of medieval literature, by me, Mom Chilo. This podcast is dedicated to bringing light to medieval stories and viewing them from a traditional Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello everyone. Today we're going to be going over an old church Slavonic text titled The Narrative, Passion, and Encomium of Boris and Gleb. So we're covering another work of hagiography here, but instead of focusing on some Western saints like we do with like Saint Guthlic and Saint Stephen of Hungary, we're heading east over to Russia and talking about Boris and Gleb. This work, unlike the other works, which were either in Latin or Old English, this work is actually in Old Church Slavonic. And there's also going to be another text that I'll be referencing and using to supplement this text. Namely, that's going to be the Russian Primary Chronicle. Specifically, I'll be using the Laurentian text. And so these texts, the Russian Primary Chronicle and the hagiography of Boris and Gleb, they were written around the same time. The Encomium was written probably around 1050 or sometime a little bit after that, whereas the Primary Chronicle was written probably just a tad bit later in the early 1100s, or maybe the very end of the 11th century. So in terms of chronology and when these texts are written, it's very similar in dating to the hagiography of Saint Stephen that we read a couple episodes back. And around, I think I mentioned this in a previous episode, but around this time, like the 900s going into the 1100s, you had a lot of Northern Europeans and Slavic, the Slavic parts of Europe, converting to Christianity or becoming Christian. And so there's a lot of works that spring up around this time to document that process and talk about, specific saints and things that happened during this sort of kind of new wave of Christianization that was spreading across Europe. But besides dates and a couple other little details I was able to find, I was able to find very, very little about this text in English. I know I've said in a couple other episodes that various texts that we've discussed, I was also able to find very little. But I think that this, at least so far, has been the text that I've been able to find the very least about. So to set the stage for our story today, it's going to take place in what's called, in today's terms, in modern academic language, Kievan Rus. However, that term wasn't really used at the time. I don't think it was ever really used at the time. It's similar to how the word Byzantium or Byzantine is kind of a neologism, and no one in that empire ever called themselves really Byzantine. They just considered themselves Roman. In the same way, no one in Rus considered themselves part of Kievan Rus. Rather, it was simply Rus. And the name Kievan Rus is just a neologism. And I think, and this is just speculation on my behalf, but I think that Kievan Rus has been used for the reason the term has become so popular in usage is because certain political implications of the name of adding Kievan to Rus. I'll let you extrapolate how that can be used for political purposes. But for us in Kievan Rus, or in Rus, which what we're dealing with, it was a polity with its center of power in Kiev, so that much of that name is true, I guess. And as the name suggests, its borders were parts of modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia, and it bordered the then kingdoms of Hungary and Poland. But Rus wasn't really a monarchy in any real sense. Although there was kind of like one leader, it wasn't what we typically think of as a monarchy. Rather, it was more so a confederation of various princes and principalities. That's why you often hear people talk about the Russian princes and whatnot. That's what they refer to, these princes who have power within Rus in this sort of confederation, tribal style system. This style of governance was kind of popular during this time in early medieval Europe. For instance, we talked a little bit about a similar system, but not exactly the same, in our episode on Saint Stephen of Hungary. And one feature of the Rus's political system that I want to elaborate now, because it's going to become important later on when we get to the story, is that in terms of succession, as in who gets to be the next ruler, there was no concept of primogeniture. So, for instance, normally when we think of, kingdoms and monarchies, we think that, if the king dies or when the king steps down, the person who takes the throne is then either his eldest child or maybe more specifically his eldest son. Or if he doesn't have any eligible children, it then goes to, his brother and then, his children perhaps, etc., etc. And it's a very sort of defined system where it's very clear who the heir is, at least in most circumstances. However, in Rus, that really wasn't the case at all. Rather, it was based off of seniority. And how exactly seniority was defined was always a subject of contention. So in Rus, there was a lot of dynastic disputes that came about, after the previous Grand Prince of Kiev died, because the exact rules for determining seniority weren't exactly clear. Generally speaking, the principle was that the oldest within a generation is, elevated to the Grand Prince of Kiev. So, for instance, if you're the ruler and then you die, then this principle of succession would look at all your brothers and your cousins, and then the oldest one would come to the throne. And typically, there was only 3 people per generation allowed. So if you died and then maybe your brother gets on the throne, and then maybe one of your cousins then gets on the throne, after that person dies, then it would then go to the nephews and children of that person, and then it would choose amongst the eldest there. But there was a lot of wiggle room, and people often had various different interpretations that they used to justify their claims to the throne. So this story takes place in about 1015, which, if you remember the dates I gave for the writing of these stories, means that this story was written pretty quickly after all these events took place. And I'll touch a bit more on that later. So at 1015 in Rus, the Grand Prince of Kiev is Vladimir the Great, or Saint Vladimir. So Saint Vladimir is the one who brings about, or he's one of the people who brings about the Christianization of Russia. There was previously, for instance, his grandmother, Olga, or Saint Olga of Kiev, she was a Christian. She had actually converted to Christianity, and that's a kind of interesting story in and of itself. But it didn't really pass on to her grandchildren. So Vladimir becomes also a convert, and then he starts about an official process of Christianizing Rus. There's what's called like the baptism of Rus, and there's like some famous paintings you can see and icons of it, which are pretty cool. But our story takes place at the very end of Saint Vladimir's life. So he has a variety of sons. It actually says he has 12 sons. And he has various different women that he fathered these children with because he was polygamous when he was still a pagan. 2 of his sons are Boris and Gleb, and they actually have the same mother. And then you have the main antagonist of our story, who's going to be Sviatopolk. And Sviatopolk is not actually the biological son of Vladimir, rather he is his brother's son. And then here it gets a bit weird because his brother, who is Sviatopolk's biological father, defrocked a Greek nun because he was kind of aroused by her beauty, and then got her pregnant. But then Vladimir, in a sort of dynastic dispute, killed his brother and then took his wife while she was still pregnant. So because of this, we're told that Vladimir did not love Sviatopolk. And we see already from the outset that Sviatopolk already has these sort of like corrupt origins. And then one of the things the Grand Prince of Kiev can do is that he can put his children as a sort of local princes of the various cities in Rus. So that's exactly what he did, even for Sviatopolk. So Saint Vladimir is now sick, and he's on his deathbed, although he doesn't quite know it yet. But he's attacked by the Hungarians, like the Pechenegs, who we talked about in the St. Stephen episode, these sort of nomadic or semi-nomadic at this point peoples. And then he sends out his son Boris to go out to fight them. And he actually gives him his army to go and try to fight them. And then Boris, it says that he does this out of obedience to his father. But he's not actually able to find the Pechenegs. He's not able to find the enemy. So he's kind of returning back with the army now. But while he's returning, not able to find the adversary, he gets a message from a messenger. And the messenger tells him news that his father has died. And the messenger also reveals that Sviatopolk, who was with his father in Kiev, or his adopted father in Kiev, The messenger reveals that Sviatopolk tried to hide the news from Boris, and Boris immediately recognizes that his brother has ill intents for him, to say the very least. So after he laments for his father, Boris says about his brother, Sviatopolk, he says, "He has learned worldly vanities and contemplates my murder. If he sheds my blood and attempts to slay me, then a martyr shall I be unto my Lord, for I shall not resist, because it is written, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble." And the apostle says, so this refers to the apostle Paul, "He who says, I love God and hateth his brother is a liar. And again, there is no fear in love. Perfect love casteth out fear. Therefore, what shall I say, or what shall I do? Lo, shall I go to my brother and say, Be a father to me, you are my brother and elder, what is your command, my lord?" So Boris, citing scripture, is explaining why he is not going to resist his evil brother, even though that he knows that he is probably going to die, because he wants to, in a sense, emulate Christ. And I'll talk more about this at the end, but this has to deal with this idea of like a passion bearer, which is what Saints Boris and Gleb are called, the passion bearers. And it's when you die, not necessarily for the name of Christ, like when someone says, give sacrifices to this idol, or else I will kill you, and that person is considered a martyr. Rather, a passion bearer is someone who suffers like Christ, you can say, and they suffer in trying to emulate Christ, even if their faith per se isn't necessarily at stake. It's more about, how do I say this? It's about meekly and with humility accepting mistreatment or some other form of punishment when it is not just, and when you can resist it, but you don't, right? So that's sort of what the word meek means. It's when you have the strength to, fight back, to do something in revenge, but you show self-restraint in not doing it, even though you could do it. And Boris here isn't just lamenting for the death of his father and for his, own life, or, potential for him to be killed, which he sees as a very real possibility, but he's also lamenting for his brother. So this is his brother Gleb. And Gleb is actually his full brother. So, Vladimir had lots of children. In fact, we're told that he had 12 sons, but, with a bunch of different women. However, Boris and Gleb are from the same mother. And it's interesting to see what the author is doing here, because he's equating Boris and Gleb to be like Joseph and Benjamin. So, as I said, we're told that Saint Vladimir had 12 sons, kind of like the 12 tribes of Israel. And in the same way that Boris and Gleb are from the same mother and from a polygamous father, Joseph and Benjamin are also full brothers from a polygamous father. And now this, analogy to Joseph isn't, accidental. And I'll come back to that just in a second. But going on with the story, Sviatopolk then sends a letter or a messenger to Boris, and he says that he wants to see him in Kiev, and he uses all these very nice words. But Boris is aware that this is a trick in order for Sviatopolk to easily kill him. It's kind of suspicious that his father has died, but, Sviatopolk didn't mention anything about that in the message that he sent out. And now you have to remember that, Boris went out with his father's men, and, they didn't engage in battle. So he has this whole army of men who are, having even been, worn from battle. And they tell Boris that they're willing to go and fight for him against his brother Sviatopolk to put Boris on the throne. But Boris rejects this. So we see again this sense of meekness. He has the ability to overthrow his brother, but he doesn't do it. He's going to accept whatever comes to him and not try to, use force to overcome it. And then now going back to the analogy with Joseph that was made earlier in the story, you remember that Joseph, his brothers sold him into slavery, and then, he went into Egypt as a slave and then eventually became, Pharaoh's right-hand man. And then when his brothers come to him, seeking food from the famine, he has all the ability in the world to just kill his brothers if he had wanted to. Yet he doesn't. He shows this, sense of meekness. He can, enact his own revenge if he wanted to, but he doesn't. Much like Boris here. And before we go on, I just want to read Boris's response to his father's troops when they suggest that he go and try to overthrow Sviatopolk. He says, "It is not for me to raise my hand against my own brother, and especially against an elder one, whom I would have as a father." So there's a potential for revolution. He very well could enact a revolution and introduce that revolutionary trope. However, he doesn't. Instead, he's going to respect the hierarchy, respect the authorities, even if they are unjust, because by submitting to them, he is submitting to God, even though they're going to do injustice to him. And then on hearing this, the troops leave him. The only people that he has with him now are his own servants and a priest. So Sunday comes along, and then Boris sets up a tent to hold the Matin service and then Divine Liturgy, or Orthros. So this is the service, to put it in Western context, this is the service that's done in the morning before the liturgy, or before the Mass. So Boris is chanting and he's meditating on his own death because he knows his own death is imminent. He assumes that his brother Sviatopolk has sent men to kill him, and he's right. In fact, while he's chanting, he hears, the assassins outside of their tent. But he keeps chanting. And the priest turns around and he sees that Boris has a look of distress on his face. And he says, "O dear and precious Lord of ours, how filled with goodness you are, that for the sake of the love of Christ, you desired not to resist, though many were the troops you held in your hands." And then the assassins come in and they stab Boris. But a servant of his named George jumps onto the assassins and tries to kind of get in the way. And he does this because he too wants to be martyred. And then they stab him to death. But at this point, Boris is still alive, bleeding out. He now gazes at the heavens and he says, "I am counted as a sheep for the slaughter. For thou knowest, my Lord, that I shall neither resist nor speak contrarily. Though I had all my father's troops in my hands, and all whom my father loved, yet I plotted not against my brother. But he has found it possible to rise up against me so greatly. If an enemy reproached me, I could have borne it. If he that hated me did magnify himself against me, I would have hid myself. But thou, O Lord, behold and judge between me and between my brother. And Lord, lay not this sin to their charge, but receive my spirit in peace. Amen." And Boris's prayer to God was so powerful and so moving that even his assailants started to weep. But eventually they did end up finishing the job and they killed him. And then they go to all of his servants and his retainers and they kill them as well. And then here the poem kind of focuses on a little detail. It brought it up a little bit earlier, and it's this gold chain that one of his retainers, specifically George, the one who jumped on the assailants in order to also be martyred, he has this gold chain around him. And it said that, the assailants, they couldn't pull it off of him. They couldn't yank it off. So what they have to do is that they have to chop his head off and then take it off that way. And even if we look to the primary chronicle, which doesn't have as much detail as this work does, it also includes this little detail about the gold chain. And we're actually told that George received the chain from Boris. Now, I don't really know what to make of this and why this detail is included several times in this story and then once even in the primary chronicle, but I thought I would throw that out there and maybe one of y'all has an idea. Now the devil then tells Sviatopolk that he should kill Gleb, Boris's brother. So he conceives of this deceitful trick. He's going to send a messenger to Gleb and he's going to tell him that his father is dying and he's sick on his deathbed and that his father wishes to see him. But of course Sviatopolk knows that his father is dead, and so he's just doing this as a way to lure Gleb near him. However, another brother, Yaroslav, hears news of his father's death, and he also hears news of how Boris was killed. So he sends a message to Gleb telling him not to go to Kiev and not to listen to his brother Sviatopolk. And he receives the letter from Yaroslav first, and then once he hears the news of his brother's death, he starts to lament. And I'll read some of his lamenting here. He says, "In hopeless grief I would have died with you, my lord, and now what shall I do, wretched and separated from your goodness, and from the great wisdom of my father? O my dear brother and lord, if you received courage from the Lord, pray for me in my grievous hopelessness, that I may be made worthy to receive the same passion, and to abide with you, rather than in this deceitful world." And then the messengers come to Gleb. They find him on a river, and they board his boat. And the story's a bit unclear here. It looks like there was messengers sent out to tell him that his father is allegedly sick and that he needs to come to Kiev. But it also looks like that the messengers who were sent also just kill him and don't really deliver him the message. Leaving that aside, though, when Sviatopolk's men board the boat, they come with their swords bared in their hands, and then Gleb knows that his end is near. And then as they're about to kill him, he makes this prayer to God. He says, "Most compassionate and most merciful Lord, turn not from my tears, but have pity on my grievous hopelessness. See the crushing of my heart, for lo, I am being slaughtered, and know not why, nor understand for which wrong." And then a little bit later he says, "For behold, my soul is prepared before thee, Lord, and we lift up our praise unto thee, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and always and forevermore. Amen." And then here, interestingly, the person who kills him is actually his cook. And we learn that this cook, it says, drew a knife and seizing the Blessed One, so Gleb, slaughtered him like a meek and innocent lamb. It was in the month of September, on the 5th day, on Monday, and a pure and fragrant sacrifice was brought to the Lord. And he entered into the dwelling places of heaven, and came to the Lord, and saw the brother whom he desired, and both received the heavenly crown which they had desired, and they rejoiced in the great ineffable joy which they had attained. So Boris finally got his wish of being able to see his brother. But during Sviatopolk's sort of consolidation of power by taking out various rivals or potential rivals or claims to the throne, there's also another brother who's killed. And a little bit confusingly, that brother's name is Sviatoslav. So Sviatopolk also killed Sviatoslav. But there's really just not that much information about him. In the Encomium, besides the list of all of Vladimir's children, he's not ever mentioned again. And in the primary chronicle, he's only mentioned thrice. So the first time is, when there's the genealogy of Vladimir and all of his children. The second time is when it talks about which city he placed all of his sons under. So again, just kind of in that genealogy. And then the third and the last time that we hear of him, it's in this sentence. It says, "The impious and evil Sviatopolk killed Sviatoslav in the Hungarian mountains after causing him to be pursued as he fled into Hungary." And that's the last that we hear of him. And, very little, at least in my research, has ever been written about him, at least in English. Maybe in Russian or other languages, there's a bit more. However, he's not even, for instance, canonized like Boris and Gleb were. But I'll touch a little bit more on this later. I just wanted to mention that Sviatopolk also killed other people, not just Boris and Gleb. But a succession dispute breaks out between Yaroslav and Sviatopolk. And the Encomium is clear to say that God was on the side of Yaroslav against Sviatopolk. And the last battle between Sviatopolk and Yaroslav takes place at the site, or at least near the site, where Boris was killed. And Yaroslav prays before the battle, and he says, "Behold, the blood of my brother crieth out unto thee, O Lord, just as the blood of Abel did in times past. Avenge him too, afflict him with the sorrow and fear, just as thou didst the fratricide of Cain. Yea, I beseech thee, O Lord, may they receive accordingly. And though ye are departed in body, yet in grace ye live, and stand before the Lord. Help me with your prayer." So Yaroslav is asking for God's help, but he's also asking and praying to his brother for his help as well. And then it's during this last battle that Yaroslav dies. And the story is quite harsh about him. He says, "Thus was he deprived of both lives. Here he lost not only his princedom, but also his life. And there he was not only bereft of the kingdom of heaven and life with the angels, but was given over to torment and fire. And his grave exists even to this day, and from it issues an evil stench for the edification of men." And then the story goes on to equate his sort of a wretched death to people like Lamech, Cain, and the Emperor Julian the Apostate. With Yaroslav on the throne, there's now peace in the land of Rus, and he begins to search for the bodies of Boris and Gleb. He's able to find Boris's body pretty easily, but he's not able to find Gleb's body, because Gleb's body, and he doesn't know this yet, but it had basically just been thrown into a nearby forest. It wasn't even buried. And then Yaroslav hears these tales about this certain spot in Rus where this fire comes out of, and where people hear angels singing. and he realizes that this is the spot where Gleb's body lies. And when they find the body, they then move it to a grave aside Boris. And since this is a saint's body, of course, it's incorrupt. It has this great smell coming from it. It hasn't been subject to decay. And even though it wasn't buried and it was in the middle of a forest, it wasn't eaten by any wild animals. And then to end the first part of the story, the author ends with a praise of the saints. He says, "Therefore, I know not how to praise you, nor am I capable, and am at a loss for words. Shall I call you angels? For you were briefly at the side of the sorrowing, but you have lived on earth as flesh among men. Shall I call you men? But you surpass all human understanding by the multitude of your miracles and visitations to the infirm. Shall I speak of you as rulers or princes? But you have gained in humility even beyond that of a simple and humble man, even as you have established yourselves in the high places and dwellings. You care and intercede not for one city, nor for two, but for all, for the entire land of Rus. O blessed are the graves that received your venerable bodies like a treasure most valuable. Blessed is the church in which the holy coffins containing your blessed bodies were placed." So, as I said, that pretty much wraps up the first part of this story, dealing with the lives, or at least the earthly lives, of Boris and Gleb. The story is still going to focus on Boris and Gleb, however, it's not going to focus on their lives in this world, or what was their lives in this world. Rather, it's going to talk about, we can say, their heavenly life, what they do on earth while they're in heaven. But before we get into that, the story goes into a little bit of theology and even apologia regarding the veneration of saints and the sort of idea of saints, generally speaking. So it quotes, for instance, from St. John of Damascus. And what I find interesting about this is that it shows that even in the early stages of Russian Christianity, or Eastern Slavic Christianity, there was already these translations and the reading of various Greek writers in Old Church Slavonic. And then after defending veneration and the intercession of saints, and I forgot to say this earlier, but what's interesting is that when it talks about their earthly life, the author just refers to them as Boris and Gleb. However, after they have passed and have become, these saints, with God in heaven, it refers to them not as Boris and Gleb, but rather it refers to them as Roman and David, which were their baptismal names. So Yaroslav has the bodies of Boris and Gleb moved again into a church that he builds for them. And then again, when they, translate their bodies, translate their relics, because these are saints' bodies, they emanate a sweet fragrance. And then there becomes a sort of cult of veneration around these saints. Many people go to their bodies, go to their tombs, and they pray and they ask for various healings and miracles to be done by them. And we're given a couple of examples. So one example is about a lame man, or rather a lame boy, who prayed at the tomb of the saints, and he saw the saints, so he saw them physically with his eyes, as alive, not just their bodies. So he sees them, and they ask him, "Why do you cry out to us?" And then the boy explains about, his limp leg, and then the saints heal him. But it also adds a note that not only were Boris and Gleb there, but also George, who was Boris's or David's servant, who had that gold chain, and who also was a martyr in trying to defend Boris. However, I'm not too sure if this George is officially canonized or has his own cult of veneration or anything at all. But it would be interesting. Maybe he is. I haven't really looked too much into it. So then there's another miracle that occurs where a blind man receives his sight. And then Yaroslav hears of this, and he eventually tells the Metropolitan. And the Metropolitan advised him to build a church for the martyrs. So beforehand, they were just in some random church, but now they have their own specific church built for them. And they established a feast day for the martyrs on July 24th, which was the day that Boris was slain. So already, within one generation of their lifetime, while their brother is still alive, there's an official feast day established for these saints. They're officially canonized by the Russian church. And then the story doesn't mention this, but soon after, I think a few decades later, the Greek church would recognize these saints, and these would be the first saints that the Greek church recognized. So in that sense, these saints are very important because it shows the validity of Russian Christianity. Or maybe we could say something like it shows it as its own tradition within the Orthodox world and not just a mere offshoot of, Greek and, Western Slavic missionaries. And we see that Russian Christianity start to take on its own form with its own sort of unique emphasis, we could say. So that's like this idea of like the passion bearer, which I mentioned earlier, which is someone who dies in emulating Christ, even if he doesn't necessarily die for the name of Christ. Like if a pagan tries to kill him, it's, just having that meekness and that humility that Christ showed, even if it's not necessarily what we traditionally consider to be a martyrdom. So then after Yaroslav's death, his son Izyaslav takes power. And as a little historical side note, it's interesting that his son takes power and not one of his other brothers. And this type of succession doesn't last long. There's a little bit of an attempt to do some primogeniture, I guess we could say, but then quickly it goes back to this other seniority succession method. So Izyaslav builds a new church for the martyrs after the old one had gone into disrepair. And then the hagiography goes on to talk about other miracles. But one that's interesting, for me at least, is when another blind man goes into the church of St. George. So this is like St. George, the great martyr, the famous St. George, not the St. George who was the servant of Boris. So the blind man goes in the church of St. George, and then he petitions for his sight. And St. George appears to him, and he says, "Man, why do you cry out to me so? If you need your sight returned, I say you go to the holy martyrs Boris and Gleb. And if they wish, will be able to give you the sight which you need. Grace has been given them by God to forgive and heal all sufferings and infirmity in this country, the land of Rus." So adding validity to Roman and David's passion, their martyrdom in a sense, their sainthood, we have the St. George himself, who's, one of the greatest of all the saints, universally recognized, even in the, I remember in the Hungarian episode that we did about St. Stephen, even there, St. George plays a large role, or at least plays some role. So you have this great saint deferring to these saints, which really shows that indeed these are, saints. And then the story at the end goes through a list of the various rulers of Rus and tells what they did in reference to their bodies, such as building bigger churches for them, repairing churches, and translating their relics, things like that. And that pretty much wraps up this story. So I want to read now from the Russian primary chronicle. So after describing their deaths, this is what it reads. It says, "United thus in body and still more in soul, ye dwell with the Lord and King of all, in eternal joy, ineffable light, bestowing salutary gifts upon the land of Rus. Ye give healing to pilgrims from other lands who draw near with faith, making the lame walk, giving sight to the blind, to the sick health, to captives freedom, to prisoners liberty, to the sorrowful consolation, and to the oppressed relief. Ye are the protectors of the land of Rus, shining forever like beacons and praying to the Lord in behalf of your countrymen. Therefore we must worthily magnify these martyrs in Christ, praying fervently to them and saying, Rejoice, martyrs in Christ in the land of Rus, who give healing in them who draw near to you in faith and love. Rejoice, dwellers in heaven, in the body ye were angels, servants in the same thought, comrades in the same image, of one heart with the saints. To all that suffer ye give relief. Rejoice, Boris and Gleb, wise in God." So there's this idea that we have seen throughout that their deaths, meekly accepting death unjustly, in a very real sense, sanctifies the land of Rus. There's this constant motif of, in describing their deaths, of kind of saying that they're these lambs going to the slaughter, these innocent lambs, dying. And there's this idea of like the blood itself, the blood of martyrdom, sanctifying the land of Rus. And, of course, if you go to the Bible, especially the Old Testament, even the New Testament, especially with like the crucifixion of Christ, there's this idea that blood cleanses and sanctifies. So we see the same thing happening where martyrdom, where self-sacrifice becomes the basis of this civilization, or at least it's the ideal of what the civilization could be. Because if you look at the history of Rus, the history of Russia, it hasn't always been the greatest, the holiest. However, there's always this holy remnant that is able to persist because of the martyrdom, because of the passion bearing of these saints. Because they did that, there's this holy strand that can exist now. Rather than the city or the land being founded on fratricide and glorifying the person who did the fratricide, such as, with Rome with like Romulus and Remus, or with Cain and Abel, where Cain founds a city and Cain is kind of the king of that city. Instead, you have the land venerating the person who was killed by their brother, instead of the opposite, where you praise, in a sense, the person who did the fratricide. And it's in that sense that the city of God is a lot more different than the city of man, to use, Augustinian terms here. Boris and Gleb then become the patron saints of Russia. Although I think the traditional patron saint is St. Andrew, they also become one of the patron saints of Russia as well. And we see them, although they were meek in life, they had the strength and they had the power to resist their murderers, yet they did not. But now, as intercessors for the land of Rus, they're able to, show true godly strength, in her history. So, for instance, there's stories like Alexander Nevsky, having the help of Boris and Gleb during one of his key battles. And there's all these stories involving Boris and Gleb doing these things. So they become the new protectors of Russia, but they were only able to do it not through worldly glory and passion, but rather through meekness and self-sacrifice. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for listening.